Can't even see myself. Kia ora tātou, namihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name's Hugh Campbell. Hello to all the people online. Hello to everyone who made it here today. In this yet another glorious May morning in Dunedin in March. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Meredith Niles. Welcome you back to New Zealand. We have a long history in these seminars of having distinguished Americans, scientists and other speakers come and speak to us about how things are interesting and much better in America. Although recently these days seem to be about how much things are worse in America at the moment. So we're glad to be a little lifeboat, a little place you can come and shelter from the storm for a while on your research visit to New Zealand. But also Meredith is not only a professor at the University of Vermont in areas that are very germane to the work we do here at the centre, but you have a history in New Zealand, coming through doing your PhD and postdoc in New Zealand, amongst your various other positions. And back in the days when we did social scientific work on things like comparing farmers' climate change response between New Zealand and parts of the States, which is a really useful thing to be doing. It's a pity we seem to have stopped doing research like this, so it's glad to know that those kind of research projects and programs and lines of inquiry continued somewhere in the world, and in your case, in one of the most beautiful parts of the world, in Vermont. So welcome, Meredith. We've got, how long did you want to talk for? Because
we ended
you're an interactive person. Yes, you've got plans and schemes.
I'm going to do a little activity
Great.
as well.
Okay.
About quarter of the way through.
Okay, okay.
I figured I'd leave,
yeah, leave a bit of 10, 15 minutes for question time. Sonia, are you in charge of what's happening online? Because I can't even see people online.
Yes, I don't think I have.
People, if you're online, you're alienated and cut off from our life. If you wish to ask questions or participate in the interactives, run towards CSAFE now, because the fun stuff starts quite soon, really. In fact, the fun stuff starts now. Dr. Meredith Niles, welcome to CSAFE.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for being here. Really excited to be at an institute like this one. As Al mentioned, we have a similar one at the University of Vermont, so it feels quite welcoming and quite natural to be here. So I already can't get the slides going.
Move the cursor onto the screen.
We have to put that in.
Oh,
For it to work.
yes,
Okay. There we go. Now it'll probably work.
Good.
Now I have to do the cursor. Trick with this one. If you get the cursor onto there. Let me see. Is it here somewhere? Oh yeah, just in the very bottom. Okay, so it should work now. Okay, and put it to the. Right?
You got technology.
I can. Oh, okay. There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for. Oh, we're just advancing now. Thank you so much for having me. I thought I would just first start my talk today to share a little bit about myself and also my history in New Zealand. I've done a lot of work here, so thought I'd give you a snapshot of those things. I'm going to also talk mostly about how we can help shift the direction for farmers to adopt more conservation agriculture practices. But first, thought I'd give you a little primer on how we think about that in my field. We'll do a little exercise. Any of you have a farming history or grew up on a farm? Janet and Hugh might have different perspectives on this engagement than others. And then mostly what I want to talk about today is ways that my lab and the people in my lab are trying to advance our understanding around how we think about how farmers implement sustainable management and conservation practices through a new framework that we've proposed. And then talk a little bit at the end about like what might we be missing and what are the next steps for some of that work. Okay, but first I wanted to say a bit about the University of Vermont. Anybody been to Vermont besides Hugh? One other? Oh, two? Wow, this is quite shocking compared to the rest of New Zealand, where people ask me where Vermont is, and someone asked me if it was near LA recently. No, not quite. So this is our beautiful campus, University of Vermont. We're in Burlington, Vermont. Vermont is in between upstate New York and New Hampshire, south of Montreal in the Northeast. We are on this lovely lake, Lake Champlain. It is really beautiful. We have about 12,000 and about 3,000 graduate students with the medical school as well. And we are also home to the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont, which is quite similar to the Center for Sustainability, excuse me, here. And we mobilize scholars and decision makers. We have about 250 global affiliates, including about 60 faculty fellows at the University of Vermont and international affiliates as well. So I want to bring that up because there might be a connection for some of you to become a global affiliate of our institute. We also have wonderful funding opportunities for PhD students, postdocs, and also have a program called the Macmillan Scholars, which is a faculty and residence program. If you're interested to come, you're actually paid. You could do a sabbatical there or just a week, for example. So there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration. And similar to some of your areas of focus, the GUND focuses on climate, resilient communities, equity and justice, health and well-being, and sustainable agriculture as our core themes. So we're sort of revitalizing those at the moment. So happy to talk to anyone about UVM or GUND if you're interested. But I thought I'd also tell you a bit more about myself and some of my other New Zealand research. So I have, Janet asked me, oh, like, do you identify as an economist? I said, no, but I have that identity crisis as an academic where I'm so interdisciplinary that when someone asks me like what I am, I can't really tell them. Environmental social scientist is the term I might use, food systems scientist, background in political science, PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis, but a focus on environmental policy and human ecology, and all of my work in food systems and agriculture. And I have a very long New Zealand history of my work. I first came to New Zealand in 2006 and did a ski season at Ruapehu on the Whakapapa side. I was a liftie for 6 months, lived in National Park, got to know New Zealand, came down to the South Island, moved to Wanaka for the second half of my working holiday visa, and then tried ever since to figure out how to keep coming back here. So then for my PhD work, this is actually on a farm on the North Island that Miranda knows well. I focused on understanding farmers' perceptions of climate change and their climate behaviors between New Zealand and California farmers. This well represents what I feel like kind of happens when you come to New Zealand or what people think. You just sort of are given a lamb and that is your introduction to the country. But I also did work, some of my postdoc work here as well that I'll talk about, but also started to shift more towards food security during my postdoc work. So as I'll share a bit more, I have two areas of focus, one in agriculture and one in food security. So briefly, I just wanted to share a bit about some of the past New Zealand work that I've done, as well as some current work before I talk about conservation behaviors. So this was my dissertation work, and it was a comparative study of Hawke's Bay and Marlborough with Yolo County, California. These are actually to scale. California and New Zealand are roughly about the same size. It was a series of interviews and surveys that we did with farmers across the two regions to really understand how they were thinking and responding to climate change. And a number of papers and conclusions came out of this. First, we were able to sort of benchmark where the farming population was and their climate change belief. This was circa 2011, 2012, and compare that with other countries like Australia, the UK, the US, for example, and Ireland. I also was able to sort of think about what might be the reasons behind why farmers were or were not responding to climate change. And in this paper, we were able to show that actually the limiting resource that farmers had, whether it was water versus temperature in the case of viticulture, was really a motivating factor for their adaptation behaviors. So appealing to those water-related or temperature-related concerns could be motivating for them to respond to adaptation. I also looked at how intended versus actual adoption of climate change strategies were implemented. So lots of us say we're going to go and do something. We're going to go to the gym, we're going to eat better, et cetera. But actually carrying through on those behaviors is critical. And so in this paper, we looked at what were the drivers behind actual behavior change as compared to what people said they would do. And then lastly, this was work from Marlborough in particular, looking at whether farmers were perceiving climate change in the way that the climate record actually told us. And in this case, what we found was that the water infrastructure and the irrigation expansion in Marlborough in particular seemed to be cushioning the effect of climate change because of how green things were, because of the infrastructure we had put in place in Marlborough. Farmers actually weren't perceiving the water scarcity issues that the climate record showed was there. So that was my dissertation work. And then when I was in Marlborough, I not only got to enjoy some lovely wine and enjoy Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, but I started seeing something that was very curious to me, which was sheep in vineyards pretty frequently in Marlborough. It happens in Hawke's Bay and other wine regions as well, but in Marlborough in particular, it's very prominent. And so this is baby doll wine. Has anybody ever had that New Zealand wine? It's a label. I think it's kind of an aggregation of a couple companies now. Peter Yealands was one of the first ones to advertise about how they were using sheep in their vineyards for like mowing or other various reasons. But now there's a whole label around this. And I became very interested in this. So this is a photo of some sheep grazing in this vineyard in Marlborough. And so this was one study I did in my postdoc, actually interviewing farmers who were implementing this and wineries in Marlborough, representing about 5% of all New Zealand wine production, and able to document some of the environmental and economic benefits of this integration of crops and livestock, so that farmers who were doing it were actually mowing less, saving money that way, and also applying fewer herbicides, because the sheep eat a lot of the weeds that, in fact, the herbicides can also deal with. And then we were also able to sort of, for the first time, like document what this looks like across the growing season, so that the sheep don't go in all the time. They come in at certain points. They basically come in prior to bunch closure, like when the grapes actually start to close up. And you wouldn't leave them in like while the grapes are on the vine, but you would bring them back in after harvest, and they would graze during the winter. And they're typically removed sort of like November time period. And then I thought I'd briefly mention two current projects I have in New Zealand. Although the big thing I want to talk about today, we're hoping to implement in New Zealand as well, which is why I thought I would preview it all with you. But for the last couple of years, I've been working with Dennis Wasselbaum here at the University of Otago in the economics department, and Pike Stallman Brown at Land Care Research on the survey of rural decision makers, which is, as far as I can tell, the longest running farmer survey in the world that has continually happened every 2 years. It's been happening for about 10 years in New Zealand. And it focuses on both lifestyle and commercial farmers, but you can sort of isolate those. And on average, about 5,000 Kiwi farmers respond to this survey every 2 years. And we've been looking for the last couple of years at how or if New Zealand farmers are transforming their land. So we know with climate change, for example, there's incremental adaptation, sort of little things that we might do to actually move the needle on adapting to climate change. But there's more and more calls for what's called transformative adaptation. Examples of this in Australia are literally moving whole industries to Tasmania, for example, like wine production, really transformative at the landscape scale, shifting to whole different kinds of systems. So we've been looking at that here in New Zealand to see if we see any evidence of that. And this paper is in review right now. But largely what we have found, which is pretty consistent with other places, is that across a number of different, sectors, we see what's called a lot of incremental change, backward being previously implemented, forward being likely to implement in the next couple of years. We see very little transformative change, shifting to whole different industries, in this case, is what we're calling a transformative change. And so that seems to be happening a bit more in the arable sector. But as New Zealand thinks about future farming systems and what may or may not be viable here, thinking about what the alternatives might be could be really important. And especially in a country like New Zealand, where there's no government subsidies, this transition, this adaptation is largely happening on the backs of private industry and private sector. So we're exploring some of those things right now. And then the other thing that we've been thinking a lot about, which will play into the end of my talk as well, is the relationship of farmer mental health, especially as it relates to different kinds of stresses. So the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a big focus on farmer suicides. Farmer mental health has gotten a little bit more attention. Farmers have lower quality of life and sort of overall well-being scores compared to like the national average, both in New Zealand and the US. And farmer suicide rates are higher than the average person. And there's been a lot of work that's been done around what are those stressors that might influence that. Financial is a big one, of course, financial profitability, private sector. Also, climate change is increasingly being looked at as a stressor in the agricultural sector. But I'm quite interested in the role that regulatory stress might play on farmers. So farmers are being asked to take on more and more policy and regulation considerations. And what we're finding, this is analysis we're doing right now, is that the majority of farmers from this survey have identified that climate change and environment regulations are a major source of stress for them, less so some of these other factors. Then we have a second question where we've actually asked them specifically, like, what about the regulatory process is stressful? Is it the paperwork versus the amount of regulations, for example? And we're looking at how those affect well-being and life satisfaction scores. And there's a couple interesting findings so far. So first of all, in New Zealand, this is 2023 data, by the way, last year. So this one was probably especially heightened in 2023 before some of the recent policy decisions. But what we have found is that farmers' regulation stress is significantly associated overall with lower quality of life and well-being scores among farmers. And it actually has a similar or even larger impact on their well-being than climate or financial stress. So they're just as worried about regulation as they are about their business or climate change. And the really interesting thing, which I want to explore further, is that we're finding these effects seem to switch. So for the current well-being and life satisfaction, we're finding a negative association. If they perceive that there's regulatory stress, then they have lower quality of life scores. But when we ask them about 5 years from now, quality of life scores, what they think they'll be, we're actually finding a positive association between regulatory stress and well-being outcomes. So I'm thinking about it as like, is it short-term pain for long-term gain? Like, yes, I have to deal with the climate regulation now, but maybe 5 or 10 years from now, everyone will be better off because of it. So we're looking at unpacking that a bit more. And the good news is Landcare will do a 2024 survey, 2025. So we have the opportunity to ask more questions down the road. Okay, I get out of breath a little bit easier these days. So just give me a second.
Really interesting. Point.
That one I'm very interested in.
Fascinated rather about the opposite. It's like once suddenly all those things are taken off the table now. Is it everyone feels relieved now, but slightly more worried about where they're going to be in 5 years?
Yeah. And I've looked at the code many times to make sure it's accurate, and it's a very consistent effect. So stay tuned for more on that.
Fascinating.
Okay, so I want to get a bit more into the topic I want to talk about today, conservation in particular. Broadly speaking, this is what my lab does. We look on improving environmental and health outcomes through sustainable food security. We do that in 2 ways. We work on the agriculture side, which is where I'm going to focus today, thinking about how we can better produce food sustainably for all people. We also work on the food and health equity side, in particular around food security, especially in low income, but also in the US countries. Some examples of projects in those spaces. These are the kinds of conservation practices I've worked on: water use, climate mitigation, adaptation, manure and nitrogen issues on the food side, how the COVID-19 pandemic affected food security and health outcomes. I have a graduate student focused on sustainable diets, also looking at how climate change impacts nutrition and child health outcomes, and lots of things that I think cross the middle. I know there's a few folks focused on food waste in the room, and that's some work that we've done in my lab as well, especially because Vermont was the first state in the US to pass a comprehensive food waste policy, comes all the way down to the consumer level. So technically in Vermont, we're not allowed to throw food in the garbage. It's illegal. It's not being enforced, but it's an interesting case study. So today I'm going to hone in on the work that we've been doing around farmers' adoption of conservation practices in particular. And I think this is a really important topic, not just for New Zealand, but really for the whole world. The clips that I've pulled here are all from New Zealand to give you some context, but farmers are increasingly being asked to do more and more, or the expectation is that they're really doing a lot, especially in the environment space, which is where most of these focus and is really my area of focus. So climate change, livestock exclusion from waterways, water quality issues, biosecurity issues. Farmers just increasingly have a lot of environmental issues to think about. And that's also the same in the US. We actually have in the US Department of Agriculture launched a huge program last year that I'm consulting with them on called the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. It's $3.1 billion that's being given out across 141 projects, trying to move the needle on getting farmers to adopt conservation agriculture, especially climate smart practices. They're in all kinds of different sectors, even biofuels and energy sectors, but all kinds of different kinds of agriculture. And this is a voluntary program. Now, there are regulations in the US and there are some in New Zealand as well, but many of the things that we're being asked of farmers currently are voluntary-based efforts, where we're asking farmers to adopt new practices, take on new strategies. And as we think about doing that, trying to understand where farmers are at and how we can move the needle on that adoption has been the core area of my focus. Luckily, there are people that have been thinking about how farmers make decisions for a really long time. So some of the original early work was actually published in the 1940s out of the US. Why do farmers adopt hybrid corn? For example, was like one of the first studies that came out, trying to understand farmer decision-making. As you can see from, this is Web of Science, there's a huge growth in both the number of publications in light purple and the trend line, the citations, for farmer adoption and conservation practice over time. So here's 2023, really start to see this big inflection point around 2016 in particular, where with more and more of these voluntary programs coming online, there's just a greater focus on trying to understand how do we help agriculture transition. And why I think this is really interesting from like an academic standpoint is because even though we have this long history from the 1940s of thinking about farmer adoption, we have largely relied on other theories and frameworks to drive how we think about that. So how many of you have seen this very classic diffusion of innovation theory? Yeah, Rogers from the 60s. We've got innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, the term I hate the most, laggards. No one wants to be called a laggard. Like, it's just terrible. So this has been core to a lot of these studies around farmer adoption. Okay, we have the innovators, the leaders, and we have the laggards, and we have to move the needle on the laggards. We also have used a number of other theories from sociology, psychology, the values, beliefs, norms theory, theory of planned behavior, all kinds of sociology, psychological theories, which generally sort of say there's some context that affects why someone does something. There's the characteristics, the values and beliefs of the person, a variety of things like their perceived control to implement change, attitudes and norms of others around them. And all of that then leads to behavior change. And then more recently, there's been some topic-specific theories that people have relied on. One I used in my PhD, for example, was the psychological distance of climate change, which I applied then into agriculture. So we haven't necessarily created actually a unifying framework to understand like why and how do farmers make decisions, despite the fact that agriculture is a huge contributor to environmental issues, and we're asking a lot of farmers. So this has been something I've been really interested in. So I thought we'd do a little interactive activity to start this conversation.
I'm a laggard.
And I have a hypothetical farm that I'm going to introduce to you, and a hypothetical but real practice. And you can think about this adoption curve. But let's just say, and this is like vaguely resembled off a farm I know well, that you have a sheep and beef farm in the Manawatu that's 450 hectares. And you have 450 cows, about 2,200 lambs are used at any given time. And I want you to think about using cover crops or catch crops, as they're called in New Zealand sometimes. So these are crops that can be planted after intensive grazing of forage, animals grazing forage in a field. They help catch the extra nutrients that might still be in the field, so they don't run off and cause water quality issues. They're getting tons of attention in the US. I have a whole project, which I'll tell you about, focused on cover crops. So you're trying to decide if you should actually plant cover crops on your farm, this farm, in the Manawatu. And I want you to think about, should you adopt these? Do you think this would be a good idea? Based on your vague understanding of agriculture potentially, and those things, and what would influence you? So you might think about where you might be in this adoption curve, but you might also think about like, well, what would I need to know to make that decision? So why don't you just like take a moment, and then for the folks online, you can think to yourselves. For folks in the room, you can maybe share a couple of ideas with others. Do you think you would adopt these? This is a water quality benefit. That's really good for New Zealand, right? You have water quality issues. But what would influence your decision about why to do that? I'll give you like a minute or two to share.
I'm totally a laggard. The reason I'm a laggard is because I'm one of the ill-benighted farmers in New Zealand that possesses a disproportionate share of $38 billion of private debt. We had a very difficult family transition in terms of estate management and the evil laws brought in by various socialist governments over the decades to force farms to be shared amongst all family members, the settlement of the estate, leaving with huge debt. And then a farm advisor came along who told me to, oh, a chat box just came up. So if you want to see the, yeah. And a farm advisor came along that basically said that we were a traditional sheep beef operation, that the flats basically could be turned into, we started with runoff dairy grazing, and then we basically decided to borrow $8 million and put in a dairy shed. And then, so I like your environmental ideas, but we're massively up to the gills in debt, and our bank will shut us down if we don't produce to the max.
Yep.
That's why I'm a laggard.
So debt is the big thing driving you. Yep.
Yeah.
What other things would people?
By the way, that's not actually me personally.
Ah.
No, I did channeling.
Yeah, it's very good channeling.
Yeah.
Very good channeling.
I'm thinking half my cousins.
Caroline's got cost and outcome there.
Yeah. Cost and outcome. What are some other things that people would think about?
Are there three things that would dominate your thinking, Jared? Combination of three things?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking risk, but I was also thinking, I've got my father's here, and it's like, what can I do to show that this is going to have positive outcomes? Can I put myself a little bit on the line and go out a little bit on a limb in order to actually model to other farmers that this is possible and positive, and then other people will come and see and learn from that. So that's more down the kind of innovating.
Yeah,
things.
sounds like your dad might have been in this space.
I would say Gordon Stevenson was probably the 0.110001% of the 2.5%. Yeah. Without exaggeration.
We already had a little bit of that
Oh,
conversation.
okay.
Yes.
So I think we had an innovator farmer for sure in that space, but also like wanting to emulate for other farmers and
Yeah.
be a leader. Yeah.
I'm kind of in that space too, in my own head, just thinking about, I would be curious to considering, the financial costs, but looking at kind of the long game and trying to figure out, okay, well, down the road, is this gonna be actually much better cost-wise for me? But also would like to kind of, be on the forefront of, time is of the essence here in terms of, making things better, so I'd probably just personality-wise be willing to take that risk.
Yeah, the university professors speak.
Yeah. I have a whole different paper looking at how the farmers who work with university professors are completely different than all other farmers. And we should not design things based on those farmers that we work with. So I'll tell you more about that one. Two more cousins, yes.
I've got a cousin out there who is, I think, a high performing farmer by old standards in terms of productivity per hectare. Gets the fact that we kind of have to travel somewhere, but is very, very concerned about what the neighbours are. And so says, I'll be a fast follower. It's like once like 30 to 40% of the neighbourhood sign on to something, then I'm prepared to do it, but I'm not going to stick my neck out and get attacked in the pub or the co-op or whatever.
Yeah.
I have people wind down their car windows and make comments at me in the street in Eltham.
Yeah, so that cousin might wind up in this kind of space.
I'd say just to the left of the curve. Yeah.
Like look around, see how it's working for other farmers in the region, have a chat with them, see how the first couple of years might go, and then think about it. Yeah. Any other things that cross people's minds? Yeah.
We can tell I was not raised by farmers because I didn't think of any of the things that like social capital or like things that would actually affect your day-to-day life. I was thinking like soil erosion is a big problem, soil nutrition, like what I understand, like the ecology cash crops makes sense. Yeah. But I think that's a very much just an environmental perspective and not really understanding how a farm works at all.
Right. But there are.
Your farmer is basically someone who's taken Meredith's course.
Yes.
An
I'm a farmer who's willing to talk to an academic, so I'm clearly not real.
So you're in that group of farmers that are not like a lot of other farmers, but certainly, I mean, many farmers are motivated by environmental outcomes. I think a lot of them think about it in the context of the whole farm system, and other outcomes as well. But for sure, there would be potential environmental benefits from this. Yes.
answer.
We have some really interesting other additional thoughts from online. Do I own the equipment needed to plant, grow, or harvest the crop? Will I need to get a contractor? How much will it cost? How will it affect my feed supply across the whole year? What is the benefit? So really thinking more holistically across the whole farm landscape. Any other thoughts in the room on this one? Okay, so, thank you so
Don't
much.
you have an auntie with a farm, Randy?
It's not quite this one.
Not quite.
Not
quite.
Cows.
Not so many. No, they only have about 20 right now. So, oh, do I need to get the cursor back up? Oh, had it,
We're doing so
we
well.
lost it again. I can just use the materials. Okay, so I asked you to think about this, right? Like, there's this behavior, cover crop adoption, am I going to do it? But I also didn't really, some of you thought about non-adoption, right? So he was like, no way, I'm not gonna be like out in front. I'm gonna look around. I'm not going to adopt this practice. But there's also the intention to adopt, right? So there's people who aren't currently doing it, but might be thinking about it like your second cousin. I'm gonna look around for a couple of years and see. One thing that we didn't talk about, but that is also happening, is the discontinuation of practices. So a farmer who tries this for a season or two, doesn't work for a variety of reasons, and they stop doing it. We've moved backwards on implementation of conservation practices. And all of this is much more complex, as well as the conversation we just had in the room and online about the many things that actually people would be thinking about before they implement a practice. And yet, for basically the last 50, 60, 70 years, scientists have largely treated this decision as a yes, no, in the ways that we design surveys and questions about conservation behavior. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Because I'm happy to pick on myself, these are my own surveys that I've implemented over the years. This is for my dissertation work. This is the exact survey I also implemented in New Zealand with some tweaks. And here we were asking farmers about their likelihood to use these management strategies in the future. So this is around climate change related issues. And we've got basically a Likert scale, very likely to very unlikely. Will you do it? Or will you not? It was a little more complex than binary, yes, no, but basically yes or no. Learned a little bit because I didn't actually ask farmers if they currently did these things in that survey. So here's a snapshot from a survey I did in 2017 in California around water management with farmers there. And so do you use it currently? Yes or no? And how likely are you to use it in the future? Pretty simple, right? Completely overlooks a lot of complexity in terms of what we know about adoption, where we think about farmers being on these different spectrums. And so what I've been working on for the last couple of years with a postdoc of mine that is now a professor at Nanjing Agricultural University in China, Guanghan, was actually trying to broaden our perspective on how we think about this and to create a more sophisticated framework for farmer adoption. And what we've proposed, and this was published about 3 months ago, is that there's 4 aspects of adoption that should be considered. There's entirety, variability, longevity, and sophistication. And that as you move sort of through a spectrum across these things, you go from small, simple, and partial adoption to much more complex, diverse, and full adoption. And so what do we mean by each of these? So entirety would be the degree to which an innovation is adopted. In the case of our cover and catch crops, are you going to go out here and plant your entire farm in cover and catch crops after your forage? No. If you even think about doing it, you're probably going to trial it on one paddock or one field to see.
And paddock where the neighbours couldn't see.
Right, on the back, all the way at the back.
Yep.
Nothing going by it, right?
Yep.
We don't capture that if we just ask, are you doing this or not, right? So how much are you implementing this practice? The variability of it. This is all graphically oriented towards cover crop, catch crop adoption, what we just talked about. But you could also just plant a single species, or you could plant a very diverse mix of cover and catch crops, which would have ecological benefits, habitat benefits, they could look differently. So how variable is the implementation of that technology? How long is it? So people continue, discontinue, change adoption. Is it happening over a long period of time? How extent is that adoption, and how sophisticated is it? So in many cases, implementation of one practice at a farm actually allows for implementation of other practices as well. In this case, you could graze cover crops also. You could just plant them, but you could also, for example, graze them, which would be a different kind of adoption. So we've tested this framework. Oh, it's working again. Once, that's the paper that I've noted already. So we sort of thought through this. We designed our survey specifically to answer these questions. And we implemented this survey in 27 states among arable farmers in the US in 2022. You can see some of the kinds of questions we asked as it relates to cover and catch crops to try to get at some of these things. And then use the latent class analysis to actually identify what kinds of adopters we had. And then also to predict who are those adopters, what are their characteristics, because that really helps channel technical assistance and potential framing to help certain kinds of producers do more. And what we found was really quite different than the sort of traditional adoption spectrum. We found that there were about 24% who were early adopters. The majority were non-adopters, hadn't done it. And then within the new adopter category, we had, and I'll show you more about these, what we call innovative new adopters or conservative new adopters. And then lastly, quite a large, this is not correct. Sorry, this is flipped. Because that is not 13%, but 13% were previous adopters. And so you can see that there's clearly, two categories, nearly half of our sample that don't even fit in this adoption framework. Like we haven't even talked about non-adoption here or previous adopters. And you can see that if we graph it across the questions that we asked and the different kinds of adoption components, there's some real differences. And the one I want to particularly point out to you is here. Big differences between early adopters and what we called innovative new adopters, especially on a metric of sophistication. And so Rogers, who proposed that very traditional diffusion of innovation theory, called the early adopters innovators. Like even before the early adopters were the innovators. But actually what we find is that there's a group of new adopters who are much more innovative than the early adopters. And this is kind of completely overlooked potentially in our current way of thinking. So here you can see the early adopters. These are a variety of what we call sophistication practices. So mixing, grazing cover crops, interseeding, things that are just not your basic plant a cover crop. And in blue, you can see the early adopters, the percent that were implementing these. In orange are the conservative new adopters, and in yellow are the innovative new adopters. So much higher percentages of these innovative new adopters were doing it for the first time, but they were going all in. They were like, we're going to do this and we're going to do it in a really different way. And we think this is really important as we think about, especially again, in a voluntary situation, what kinds of resources do these different kinds of farmers need? Because if we're assuming that if they're already doing cover crops, they're doing it to the most sophisticated level possible, they're maximizing all the benefits, we're actually wrong, potentially, because there's a huge opportunity for farmers to sort of innovate, even among early adopters. At the same time, just because you're a new adopter doesn't mean you might not be innovative, but there's also a huge group of people who are quite risk averse and not willing to sort of take the step to go the next step for more sophisticated practices. We also complexly predicted what actually influenced adoption. So the blue here is likely to positively influence adoption. And these are by different kinds of adopters. I'm going to walk you through, but some of the things that we found that actually influenced these adoption types were self-efficacy. Their social environmental priorities were especially important for innovative new adopters. So kind of what you said, you'd be very motivated by the environmental benefits. Social networks, we talked a lot about that here, the social capital, like being the person out in front, like your dad. That was really important for those early adopters and those innovators. The extent to which they were doing other conservation practices, the diversity of the crops they grew on their farm, as well as their perceived challenges to production, which was a major issue for non-adopters. And I'll probably just briefly mention this, but we're in the process of trying to now apply this framework into the US dairy system, which is on par, I would say, with the size and strength of the New Zealand dairy system. And quite similarly, the US dairy system industry, like New Zealand, has a net zero 2050 greenhouse gas emissions goal. And their emissions largely fall pretty equally across three areas: feed production, manure management, and enteric methane. So the digestive processes of cows, which naturally emit methane. And so we've been working with funding from the US Department of Agriculture and the Dairy Checkoff program in the US, which is, I think you have one in New Zealand as well. It's like Dairy NZ, basically, to implement a survey last year with US dairy farmers to look at where they were on climate change practice adoption, in particular, mitigation of emissions. We sent out these postcards you can see here, and we had about 920 responses across the US. And our survey, I'm happy to talk with anybody about any of these things if any of them are of interest. I'll focus mostly just here, was around the kinds of practices that farmers are adopting, their perceptions of climate change, and also climate programs and climate markets, carbon markets in particular, and where farmers are in their thinking about those issues. But we designed the survey to actually be able to test this framework again. And so we're finding some different things already with the dairy sector as compared to arable farmers. First of all, a lot more never used this practice. This is in particular focused on some grazing practices. We see even more so manure management. Our dairy sector is quite different than New Zealand in the sense that much of our dairy sector in the US is confinement dairy, either part of the year or all of the year. So these are strategies that would help pool together manure, treat manure, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Large amounts of non-adoption of these practices there. And similarly on some emerging strategies like feeding seaweed to cows, for example, a lot of non-adoption. We also see it for the future. So when we ask farmers, this is just for those manure management practices, how likely are you to do these in the future? We're also seeing a lot of unlikely. So not a lot of adoption and not a lot of likelihood either. And we're putting all of this data through the same sort of process and analysis. And what we found so far, these are preliminary results. Lauren Hunt, who's a postdoc in my lab, has been doing a lot of this great work. Much larger percent of non-adopters in this group, smaller percent of previous adopters, especially in manure management. These are like very infrastructure intensive things. So it's a bit different once you decide to make the jump on putting in a whole new barn or something like that. And then the early adopters, and in this case, just the innovative new adopters. We aren't finding that fifth category of conservative new adopters, in part possibly because, again, the infrastructure necessary for some of these practices. Some of these you brought up earlier, but when we've asked farmers about the most important factors they consider when adopting new practices, what we found was that cow welfare and farm profitability were equally motivating to farmers. They're related, of course. You can't have sick cows and be profitable. But animal welfare seems to be a very big motivator for farmers. So thinking about how to frame climate change as an animal welfare concern, for example, is something that we've thought a lot about. But just framing something as the environment is probably not going to resonate with most farmers, at least among our sample, for example. But framing protecting the environment as something necessary to ensure a future generation of agriculture, for example, or to protect your cows might be more salient. And then lastly, I think Hugh brought up some of these issues. What was really interesting to us about what perceived barriers farmers had to adopting some of these practices was not just cost. Okay, cost is always going to be a barrier. But actually, as you said, Hugh, it wasn't just the initial cost of the practice. It's the debt that farmers have and the maintenance costs of keeping up the practices. So in the US, at least, we have a lot of programs that help farmers adopt new practices. Very different than New Zealand. We have a lot of money for it, but they only pay for the initial cost. They don't help the farmers upkeep the anaerobic digester, and they certainly don't think about all the debt that you're already paying that might prevent you from doing something in the first place. So some of the next steps here is we're working on trying to predict adoption of these different practices and get the characteristics of the different kinds of farmers. But just to wrap up a little time for questions, you know, what we've been thinking a lot about in my lab is that these decisions are really complex and that historically as academics, we've probably treated them a bit too simply, at least in the quantitative social sciences. The qualitative researchers have been getting at this depth for a long time, but as we design surveys in particular, trying to get at some of these things and treating adoption as more complex is really important. And as we think about the implications of this, if we're better able to understand the motivations of different kinds of farmers, as well as the kinds of farmers that exist, we can appeal in different ways to farmers to what I think is their underlying want to do good for the environment, but think about those priorities in different ways, some of them. So how we frame this issue and how we talk to farmers could be really well informed by better understanding where they fit across these different issues. We are in the process and talking to my colleague at Landcare for actually then trying to test this in New Zealand with New Zealand dairy farmers. So a whole different political context, a whole different farming system. does this hold? What are we getting wrong? How do we improve this framework? How do we move towards better understanding? And also, I'm really interested in thinking about additional factors that affect adoption that haven't been considered, in particular mental and physical health of farmers themselves. We actually haven't thought about the fact that if you have anxiety or depression as a farmer, you're probably not willing to go out in front and be an innovator on conservation practice adoption. So dealing with some of these other challenges in rural communities may also move the needle on environmental issues as well. And then interested in testing or thinking about this in other sectors and places as well. So thank you so much for having me, and happy to talk about any of that or university or opportunities for collaboration further as well. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Meredith. Where is Pike Stallman around? It's Pike at
He's at Landcare.
Blancaire.
Yeah.
Which version of Blancaire? In Wellington or?
He's in Wellington. He is the director of the Survey for Rural Decision Makers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what he's been doing for the last 10 years or so. And then, yeah, Dennis is here, as you know.
Yeah. So look, thank you very much for a really stimulating run at farmer adoption, of which, as you know, there's no longer enough research being done on this in New Zealand. I thought there was going to be a terrible theoretical faux pas. I thought you were going to come down on the side of Rogers' adoption innovation curve, which is kind of article faith in my part of rural sociology.
Yeah.
That Rogers is just wrong. But no, you correctly moved forward to a much more sophisticated way of understanding farmer behaviour. No, I really appreciated the way in which you delved into that. I think trying to do that parallel study in the New Zealand context is going to be really, really interesting. Couldn't quite translate your results into our major area of research, which is in kiwi food industry, because yes, the early innovators got absolutely hammered. They were crazy, wacky pioneers. They did a whole lot of really stupid things, and a whole lot of them failed.
Yeah.
It was the second wave once pork research, previous plant and food research, came on board, and one maverick scientist set up a team that began to systematize and try and create a handbook that then started dragging a pilot through very successfully. And then the industry came along and said, this is the future. You all have to do this within 4 years. And the laggards ended up, the last laggards were about 4% of the industry, and they got exited.
Yeah. And that's a different model, right? I mean, that is like you basically set an industry standard and everyone's moving towards it.
Well, so that's a very good launching point for discussion, because in New Zealand, we have just gone through really the catastrophic failure of that phase.
Yeah.
And I think it was a phase that came in after a generous length of time to try and have more voluntary adoption systems happening. So New Zealand's tried a voluntary, as you know, in New Zealand, we get similar results to what you were presenting at the end, with a lot of red segments in the pie graph.
Yeah.
And then industry came and government tried to create one of benchmarks. So then we're going back to adoption. Anyway, what's your sense coming back to New Zealand of how things have changed?
Well, you also have a new government. So, yeah, I mean, I do think, to me, I don't think we're ever going to regulate our way out of everything. Yeah, you know, in the US for sure. I don't know New Zealand as well, but that's why I think this work is important. You know, there's a role for regulation. We have regulation. We have regulation in the US, we have regulation in New Zealand, but it's always going to be a battle. It's always going to be a fight, what that looks like. And also, I think there's a natural tendency when you're told what you have to do versus you're given opportunity to embrace a pathway forward that is more positive and voluntary. People react differently to those things, right? So, to me, there's a place for both. I think we need both regulation and probably voluntary adoption, but thinking more creatively and carefully than we have historically about how we move the needle on that voluntary adoption is what I'm most interested in, because we just haven't done this kind of, I think, important deeper dive into like how we actually help frame things and how we help move the needle. And I will say though, from my perspective, without government support, even for those voluntary practices, it is quite hard because there are financial realities to implementation of these practices, especially some of the ones that have the biggest environmental benefits for mitigating climate change in your animal sector.
Yeah.
Those are tricky. We don't have that. I mean, in the US, we have literally a $3 billion program right now that's paying farmers to implement some of these practices. So I do think that will be challenging for New Zealand to think about, absent a regulatory environment and a purely voluntary environment. There are real costs to farmers for implementation of some of these practices, and there's a lag time for the benefit to accrue. But ultimately, if we're asking farmers to do things that have public goods, like climate mitigation benefits, rethinking what role there might be for financial assistance, I think could be useful.
Definitely, it's a hot button issue for New Zealand.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 reasons why no governments in New Zealand think that's necessary.
Yeah.
So I channel Caroline's question to this,
Yeah.
because also was what I was thinking of as well.
Oh, yeah.
My immediate response is, I think the two things you'll find coming back into New Zealand is that, well, the one thing that's always been the same in New Zealand is that with 90% plus of that product going overseas, there's an enormous compulsion that you can't switch into New Zealand that American farmers don't necessarily face in the same way. But the other thing is that with the particular nature of the climate change response framework at a total land use level, I really like the way you've adopted, you've identified the people who pull out.
Yeah.
Pull out of the thing, which in New Zealand means basically pulling out of the farm and selling into plane trees.
Yeah.
Because it's just a massive pot of money available to struggling farmers saying, if you give up now, we're going to pay you millions of dollars to walk away from your land.
Yeah.
And that's just blows all the other stuff kind of out of the water. It's so out of whack.
Yeah.
Anyway, your thoughts on just the ones who just get out?
Yeah, I didn't include it here, but we asked a question of dairy farmers about that too. How, as a climate adaptation strategy, basically, are you going to sell your herd or get out of agriculture in general? Certainly New Zealand went through that massive structural change in the 80s when you just eliminated subsidies, and that really transitioned agriculture here. I think it's all about what priorities New Zealand has for its industry. I mean, agriculture is such a huge industry here. So if there's transition towards forestry and there's, economic benefits to that, I will have to say that one of the things I have found really interesting, having spent a lot of time here, where I'm seeing trees in New Zealand and how they're being harvested is quite shocking. I have to say, and I guess a lot of that land used to be grazed. So I don't know what the research looks like around the relative impact of harvest versus grazing on some of those spaces. But having come here for the first time 18 years ago, I just see trees in places I never would have thought I'd see trees. And how do they harvest them? I really can't even imagine. So I imagine, and it's not an area of the survey I've worked on, but there's a huge section of the survey of rural decision makers about forestry and forest use. So I imagine Pike and some of my other colleagues would be focused in that space.
The thing we're challenged with at the moment is we're experiencing moments of instant harvest via cyclones.
Yeah.
Do the Canadians have anything to say about wise use of land through forestry, or alternatives to the Pinus radiata model?
I've got someone from the West Coast.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's right. No, not to be treated around your button. You burning to ask a question here?
No, I mean, I'm so interested in, did you see much of a difference in, responses to environmental change from farmers, animal farmers versus farmers?
Climate change belief.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So I've been asking the same climate change questions for about 14 years now. Same ones I asked in New Zealand, I've asked in the US in different sectors. I've asked in Puerto Rico, I've asked in Madagascar, I've asked in lots of other countries. Pretty similar. So we found 83% of US dairy farmers believe that the climate is changing. We also ask about attribution, natural causes versus human causes. And there we find that slightly less than half, I think it's 46%, attribute climate change to humans in some way. There's people who think it's mostly caused by humans or equally caused by humans and natural causes, and then there's people who think it's only natural. So the way I look at that is, okay, that's 83% of farmers, dairy farmers who are open to a climate change conversation, whether it's mitigation or adaptation is a little different. Mitigation, there needs to probably be a human recognition for mitigation. What's interesting though is when I did the survey of New Zealand farmers in 2012, it was right about the same amount of farmers in Marlborough and Hawke's Bay who thought that climate change was happening. 46% human caused. So New Zealand, I think, has increased quite significantly. In the US, we've seen those numbers increase. I asked those same questions in California in 2012 and 2017. There was a massive drought in between those 2 years, and we saw a huge increase in the number of farmers indicating that they thought climate change was both happening and human caused. I used to be really focused on that in particular as like the thing we had to do to help farmers implement conservation practices. And I've kind of gotten away from that. I think it's something we have to consider. But I've talked to so many farmers. I've interviewed hundreds of farmers in the US and New Zealand. And many of them would tell me they didn't believe in climate change, but then simultaneously tell me about all the changes they had observed in weather over the last 20, 30 years on their farm, earlier planting dates, et cetera. So the climate change framing has mostly become political, I think. Yeah. And instead of using that or just thinking about other ways to connect with farmers about the same topic, I think is often more fruitful. So we still ask it because it's definitely a driver of why someone does something or not. But I think we're trying to get to a more sophisticated understanding. Yeah.
But I think in the age of more and more mis and disinformation as it goes on, it's going to be a challenge to. So when it is so politicized in states.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've got to 5 past, which is an hour. So Abby, is yours the last question?
Yeah,
It's an easy one.
Associated with that, I just was curious, I don't think that you, in your survey, you asked for political.
We have.
Yeah, okay, yes, but I was just wondering if maybe, like lower well-being might be associated with climate change denialism. Like you were just saying, climate change can be seen as a very political issue.
Yeah.
If lower mental health and well-being those people might tend to deny climate change or fall into.
So we didn't, so the survey of rural decision makers in New Zealand does not ask about political affiliation, but I have asked about it in surveys in the US. I stopped doing it. One, farmers get mad at you when you ask them that. They're like, why is this relevant? And they don't want to talk about it. But also I didn't necessarily find it super helpful in the sense that you could put people in buckets. Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you, Labor, National, et cetera? But we also have a lot of variability across those areas. And so, for example, in the US, like the Republican Party was the original environmental policy party. Like Nixon is the one that created the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. So I found it not to necessarily be conducive towards a broader conversation with a broader group of people if we brought politics into it. But I haven't considered how political affiliation might affect well-being outcomes. So
yeah, or just like if people change their feelings towards climate change and well-being effects.
Oh yeah, I haven't looked at how climate change perception influences well-being. But what I can tell you is the measure we had, which was being affected by Cyclone Gabrielle, that was significant. Like people who were affected by Cyclone Gabrielle did have worse quality of life and well-being outcomes, but actually it was less significant than the regulatory stress. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, at that point, we have to bring things to a halt. So thank you very much, Meredith. It's been great having you back. It's so good having you still participating in research in New Zealand in these areas. And may the relationship between New Zealand and Vermont continue to flourish before and after November the 5th in whatever form that takes. So please join me in thanking Meredith once again for a fabulous seminar.
Thank you.
The November 5th
US election.